This is the Olympus M.Zuiko Pro 8-25mm f4. It was announced in June 2021 and it weighs 411 grams and its length is 8.85 centimeters when retracted, and that's from the point of the camera up to the tip of the lens. So the part which goes inside the camera is not counted towards the length of the lens. And if I extend it, then it's obviously longer. It has an electronic focus ring, or focus by wire as they say, and it has a manual focus clutch, so I can pull the focus ring backwards and I can do manual focus, and you can see the distance here as well, so as a guide when doing manual focus. And if I push it forward again, then the camera switches back to autofocus. So when you pull this focus ring backwards, the lens stops taking orders from the camera in terms of how to do the focusing, and it's relying on the focus ring itself and the logic that all happens within the lens itself. And then when you push it forward again, then it starts to communicate with the camera again on how to do focus. It has a manual mechanical zoom ring, so the movement forward and backwards to zoom in or zoom out is mechanical, and you control it with this zoom ring. And the lens doesn't start to operate until you extend it past a certain point there. So it falls into place, and that's when the image on the camera starts to show that the lens is functioning. So you can see that the lens is retracted now, and I'm going to turn on the camera, and here you can see that it says this lens is locked, please extend the lens. So if I extend the lens, then it falls into place and you can see it start working. It has a lens function button there, if you can see that there, and you can program it on the camera in terms of what you want it to do. And the lens has a lens hood, which is the Olympus LH-76E, and this lens hood is included when you actually buy the lens, so you don't need to buy the lens hood separately. The front lens cap is the LC-72C, and the number 72 refers to the filter thread size. So the filter thread size on this lens is 72mm, and the lens cap is the Olympus LC-72C. It has a maximum aperture of f4, and that's a constant f4 aperture throughout the zoom range, and the minimum aperture is f22. It has 7 aperture blades, and the diagonal angle of view is 107 degrees at the widest and 47 degrees at the narrowest. The closest focusing distance is 23 centimeters, and that's 23 centimeters across the full range of the zoom, and the 23 centimeters is from the focal plane of the camera, so essentially where the sensor is, to the subject that you're filming. So you have to think about the length of the lens and how close to the lens it actually is. So when you're thinking about 23 centimeters from the focal plane of the camera to the subject. So the disadvantages of this lens are that it's big and it's heavy, so it's not really suitable for smaller camera bodies like the EM10 Mark IV, the EM5 Mark III, or the OM-5. And it also has a major problem with the locking. So when the lens is locked, you have to extend it until it starts to function. But a lot of the time when you extend the lens doesn't seem to register that. So you extend the lens past a certain point and it falls into place, you could hear that. But the lens still doesn't register it, and it doesn't communicate that to the camera. So on the camera, it might still say that the lens is locked, even though it's not actually locked. So whatever gear mechanism they have in this doesn't work properly. And there's a few problems with that. Well, the first problem is that sometimes when I turn on the camera and I want to film, I need to extend it and retract it 10-15 times before it registers it. And that's just a little bit annoying, but it doesn't matter too much because it's only once when you turn on the camera. But the problem is when you're recording video and you're zooming in or zooming out, suddenly it triggers the electronic lock, and what happens as a result is that the video recording stops. So you could be recording something at a wide angle, and then just as you're zooming in to capture an important moment, it triggers the lock and the video recording stops abruptly. So you end up losing the shot that you wanted. And I think that's a significant problem for video recording. For photography, I guess it doesn't matter that much because then you can just redo, zoom in and zoom out, and it will fall back into place again. But for video recording, you will lose the shot. And it might be the case that it's just my copy which has this problem, or maybe it's been damaged, but the point is that the design is not a good design for this to happen in the first place anyway. So on the older lenses, you had this type of lock here. So you would physically push it and then extend the lens. And this seems to function a lot better. I've never had any problems with these type of lenses. And there's a few of them. So there's the 9 to 18 millimeter, which has this lock. And also there's the 12 to 42, which also has this lock for extending. So this was the previous design they had in order to keep the lens this small and also allow you to extend it when necessary. So on this Pro, they've tried to make something better, but it's turned out to be worse in my opinion anyway. I'm curious to know if anyone else has had this problem or whether it's just my lens that has this issue. The advantages of this lens are that its focal range is perfect for video recording, in my experience anyway, and for what I want to shoot. So the ultra wide 8mm is perfect, and also I can zoom into 25mm, which is the standard. And beyond that, I probably wouldn't want to zoom that much anyway, particularly when I'm doing handheld video recording, because at that point the camera shake would essentially make the video unusable anyway. So 8 to 25 is the perfect focal range in my opinion for the type of shooting that I'm doing. And the image quality on this lens is really good in terms of handling side light or backlit situations. So it handles that really well, and you don't get bad flares. So you get some flare, but not significant. And you also don't get ghosting or bad chromatic aberration. So everything is really well controlled. And also the distortion is minimal. So even at the 8mm ultra wide view, the distortion is minimal. So it's really good in that sense. I think this focal range and the image quality is perfect for this type of lens. And if you know any lens that has this focal range and better image quality, then let me know, because I would be really keen to try that lens as well. But the only complaint I have about this lens is that the locking mechanism it has is not good, and it's a significant problem. But apart from that, I think it's a good lens. And I think this is the only lens which is an M.Zuiko Pro lens, which I'm not happy with. Any other M.Zuiko Pro lens I've had has been really good in all aspects and functionality. This is the only one which has this locking problem, and in my opinion is not good. Having said that, I still do use this for handheld work. So I haven't made the switch to another lens. So I'm essentially just putting up with the problems that it has. But at the same time, I am looking for an alternative, and a lot of the time when I would be using this lens, sometimes I end up using a different lens because of that issue. So it depends on whether for that particular scenario I can put up with this video cutting out or not, and whether the locking is a problem for that particular scenario. So if we compare this to other Micro Four Thirds lenses, one lens that comes to mind is the 9 to 18mm. So this is not an M.Zuiko Pro, it's just a regular Olympus M.Zuiko lens. And just to go through the differences, the 9 to 18mm weighs 155 grams, whereas the M.Zuiko Pro one weighs 411 grams. So there's a big weight difference between this one and this one. And the length of this when retracted is 4.95 centimeters, whereas this one is 8.85 centimeters. This one has a maximum aperture of f4 to f5.6, whereas this has a maximum aperture of f4, and that's a constant f4 throughout the zoom range. And the minimum aperture for both of them is f22. The diagonal angle of view on this one is 100 degrees, and at the telephoto end is 62 degrees. So obviously this is 8 to 25 and this is 9 to 18, hence the difference. The closest focusing distance on this one is 25 centimeters and 23 centimeters on the M.Zuiko Pro. And this one doesn't have a manual focus clutch, and it doesn't have weather sealing, and the image quality can be bad in challenging situations. So for example, the ghosting is really bad. It has flaring, has chromatic aberration, and the distortion is substantially worse than on this lens. And another thing which isn't good is that the friction on the zoom ring is not consistent across the full focal range. So if you want to zoom in or zoom out smoothly, this is not a good lens for that. Whereas the zoom ring on this one is good, and the locking problem that has is a separate problem, but the zoom ring itself is actually uniform and smooth. And the other problem with this one for video recording is that the aperture is not constant unless you set it to f5.6 or a higher number. So at the widest, the maximum aperture is f4, and at the telephoto end, the maximum aperture is f5.6. So that can also be a problem for video recording if you want to record at an aperture less than f5.6. So overall, the compromise is whether you want small and lightweight, or whether you want high quality but bigger and heavier. So I use this lens for doing YouTube videos. So all these YouTube videos that I record, I just had to change my lens for this particular one because I wanted to show this lens. But all of these videos are recorded with this one. So even though I'm saying that the image quality on this one isn't great, it's perfect for doing YouTube videos because it has a good focal range from ultra wide if I want to show something big in the picture, and I can also zoom in if I want to show a close-up of something. But the image quality isn't perfect for other type of video recording that I want to do, which is the reason that I use the 8-25 M.Zuiko Pro lens instead. And the M.Zuiko Pro lens would be way too heavy for me to attach it to a small camera like the EM5 Mark III and then record these type of overhead shots. So I would need a bigger rig to hold it down securely, and also the problem that it has with the locking mechanism means that I would have to rotate it back and forth and vibrate the camera to try to get it to work, so that would be frustrating. Whereas when you're doing handheld work, even if you do back and forth the zoom ring, it's not a big deal. Another lens to compare this to is the Panasonic Leica 10-25mm f1.7. So I don't have that lens, so I can't show it to you, but that one weighs 690 grams, so it's even heavier than this one, which weighs 411 grams. And that one has a length of 12.8 centimeters, whereas this one is 8.85 centimeters. But the maximum aperture on that one is f1.7, whereas on this one is f4. So there's a big difference in aperture between these two. And the Panasonic Leica one has a minimum aperture of f16, whereas this one has a minimum aperture of f22. So there's a difference there as well. The diagonal angle of view on the Panasonic Leica one is 94 degrees at the widest and 47 degrees at the narrowest. So again, there's a difference obviously in the focal range and hence the angle of view. And the closest focusing distance on the Panasonic one is 28 centimeters, whereas it's 23 centimeters on this one. And the Panasonic one isn't weather sealed to the same level as the M.Zuiko Pro lens. But essentially, the main differences come down to a few things. One is that the Panasonic is less wide at 10 millimeters, whereas this one goes down to 8 millimeters. But the Panasonic Leica has an aperture of f1.7, whereas this one is f4. And again, the Panasonic one is bigger and heavier. For my personal use, the way I use it to record sports handheld, I prefer to have the 8mm ultra wide angle of view as opposed to the 10mm, and also the Olympus one is lighter and smaller, so that also works well for me. So those are the preferences I have, and that's why I won't go with the Panasonic one, because 690 grams is way too heavy for handheld work for a long duration of time. Another lens to compare this to is the Panasonic Lumix 12-35mm f2.8 Mark II. And I know there's a Mark III version of this lens, but I don't have the Mark III. So this one weighs 305 grams, whereas the Olympus one weighs 411 grams. So the Panasonic one is lighter and also smaller at 7.38 centimeters, whereas 8.85 centimeters on the Olympus one. And the maximum aperture on this one is f2.8, whereas it's f4 on this one. So the maximum aperture is brighter on the Panasonic Lumix lens, and the minimum aperture for both of them is f22. And the diagonal angle of view on the Panasonic one is 84 degrees at the widest and 34 degrees at the narrowest. And the closest focusing distance on the Panasonic one is 25 centimeters versus 23 centimeters on the Olympus one. Again, the Panasonic one isn't weather sealed to the same level as the Olympus M.Zuiko Pro lens. So in summary, the Panasonic Lumix 12-35mm f2.8 is slightly lighter, slightly smaller, and it has a brighter aperture at f2.8. So the only disadvantage of the Panasonic one in comparison to the Olympus one is that it's less wide at 12mm versus 8mm. But in my experience, that ultra wide 8mm makes a big difference, particularly when video recording in certain situations. So the other thing is the Panasonic Lumix one has the optical stabilization as well, but that only works well with the Panasonic cameras. So it depends on which camera you're using. So if you're using the Panasonic camera, then obviously this is a good choice because you also get the optical stabilization. And in my experience, the Panasonic Lumix cameras don't have a good in-body image stabilization, whereas the in-body image stabilization on the Olympus cameras are substantially better. So if you can get lens stabilization with the Panasonic cameras, then that always helps. So I tend not to use Panasonic Lumix zoom lenses, and the reason for that is that the direction of the zoom ring moves in different directions on Panasonic cameras and Olympus cameras. So the only reason I have this lens is because I got it when I bought the GH6. So there was a bundle sale. So I bought the camera and this lens together, and it was a good price at the time. But at the time I didn't actually realize that the Panasonic lenses actually have a zoom ring which rotates in the opposite direction to Olympus lenses. So after using it once, I never used it again because it wasn't working with my muscle memory. So I was twisting the zoom ring in the opposite direction that I intended to do. And when you're doing video recording, that's not really practical. So going forward, I only buy Panasonic lenses which have a fixed focal length as opposed to zoom lenses. And any lens that I buy, I make sure that the orientation of the zoom ring is the same as the Olympus lens, unless I want to change all my lenses into the opposite direction, which I think is probably not worth it. Because all of these different manufacturers, they typically have lenses in the same range with the same features anyway, so I just need to make sure I buy the right one. Another lens to compare this to is the Olympus M.Zuiko Pro 12 to 45mm f4, and this lens weighs 254 grams, so it's substantially lighter than the 411 grams of this lens, and its length is 7 centimeters when retracted, whereas the 8 to 25mm is 8.85 centimeters. So even though this is a M.Zuiko Pro lens, it doesn't have a manual focus clutch, unlike almost all of the other M.Zuiko Pro lenses. And it also doesn't have a lens function button. And the diagonal angle view on it is 84 degrees at the widest and 27 degrees at the narrowest. But the closest focusing distance on the 12 to 45 is 12 centimeters, whereas it's 23 centimeters on the 8 to 25. So the 12 to 45 is smaller and is lighter, and it has a closest focusing distance of 12 centimeters. But the main disadvantage it has is that it's not as wide, so it's 12 millimeters as opposed to 8 millimeters on this one. So I don't know if this is a good comparison, but a lot of the time I use the 12 to 45, and it obviously has a bigger telephoto range, although for my type of usage, the ultra wide angle is much more useful than the extended 45 millimeter telephoto end. So it really depends on what you're looking for, but this lens is smaller and lighter. So in terms of weight and telephoto range, it's better than this lens, but this lens has the ultra wide angle of view, which is really important. Another lens to compare this to is the Olympus M.Zuiko Pro 12 to 40mm f2.8 Mark II, or I should say OM system 12 to 40mm f2.8 Mark II. So this has been rebranded as OM system. I think the first version of this lens was Olympus, but this one is now OM system. So these two lenses are very similar. So this one weighs 382 grams, whereas 411 grams on this one, so very similar weight. This one is 8.4 centimeters long, whereas this one is 8.85 centimeters. Again, similar size. And this one has a maximum aperture of f2.8, whereas this one is f4. And both of them have the same minimum aperture at f22. The diagonal angle of view of this one is 84 degrees at the widest and 30 degrees at the narrowest, which is obviously reflected based on the focal range that they have. So again, this lens doesn't have that ultra wide view that you get with the 8mm on this one. And the closest focusing distance for this lens is 20 centimeters, whereas it's 23 centimeters on the 8 to 25mm lens. So to summarize, these two lenses are very similar in terms of weight and size and features, and both of them are M.Zuiko Pro lenses, so they have the focus clutch, they have the lens function button, they're both weather sealed. So the only main differences between them is that this one has an aperture of f2.8 and this one is not as wide as this one. So I don't know if this is a good comparison or I should only be comparing this lens to ultra wide angle lenses, but I thought I mentioned this lens as well. So just to mention what's included in the box when you buy this lens, essentially you get the lens hood, which is the Olympus LH76E, and there's the front lens cap, which is the LC-72C, and there's obviously a rear lens cap on it as well, which is the LR-2, and you also get a, let me open this box, I think I should still have it. So there's the instruction manual, and there's a warranty card, and there's a wrapping cloth with the model number CS-53. So you get the CS-53 wrapping cloth, and you get the lens hood and the lens itself. So one of the things is about the M.Zuiko Pro lenses is that you get the lens hood with the lens when you buy it, whereas with some of the non-pro lenses you don't get the lens hood, you have to buy the lens hood separately. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions about this lens, or if you want me to compare it to any other lens or provide sample footage of using this lens.